I started my life in a small town outside of Bucharest, Romania, with no father and a mother who had two children she couldn't take care of. And so many of my early months were spent alone on a countertop crying while my mother was out. Eventually, I wound up in an orphanage. And like other children who wind up in orphanages, they're crowded full of the need of love and to be hugged. And so I adapted, and I learned to soothe myself at a young age, and in extension began numbing myself to the nurturing I should have been receiving. Growing up as a child with reactive attachment disorder, it was a difficult process. For those of you who don't know about it, it is something that most children who are adopted struggle with all their life. For some, they form unhealthy affections and connections towards other people and use them to kind of manipulate their way, while others take everything upon themselves. They don't ask for help out of fear of abandonment, disappointing other people, or possibly losing control. I'm of the latter nature. I've worked all my life to be one step ahead of everybody else out of fear of being abandoned or possibly losing control. And so that is just a beginning part of my journey. And unfortunately, it resulted in a lot of numbing myself to some of the things that I had to go through. Growing up as a child diagnosed with reactive attachment disorder, I had a lot of struggles. And unfortunately, RAD was not commonly well understood at the time, and common practices of the day were rather damaging. One such practice that did exist was called holding therapy. And what happens is that the parent or the guardian takes the child in their lap and holds them tightly in an effect to kind of restore those lost bonds through eye contact and physical touch. But what happens is that the child doesn't really result well with that, because what you're doing is you're teaching a child who already mistrusts the world that it is okay to submit to the force of another human being. And so thankfully, this practice is not well used anymore, and it didn't put me off to therapy as a whole for the rest of my life. It did, however, reinforce that numbness within. Growing up in a religiously conservative family, I was always taught how to help other people first. And if you had problems, and I had plenty of problems, you dealt with them internally, you didn't talk about it, and you stayed focused on helping other people. The positive of this is I now have a successful career in philanthropy that I love. The negative is that I never really learned how to ask for help myself back then. And so when I came out at the age of 16 to my parents, I didn't really know what I was asking for, and unfortunately went through several months of conversion therapy. But what is positive about that is that I was a useful vessel, if you will, for that lesson of helping other people first. Because in theory, I had already learned how to adapt to many different environments on my own. I was constantly at odds with the people who had saved my life. And coming out gay only reinforced that and the numbness within. And so it was easy to slip back into the closet and put on a more acceptable front. But it required me to allow other people to speak on my behalf and to make decisions for me that at the time were untested. Fast forward 5 years, and I found myself in a successful career teaching individuals with intellectual disabilities. But there were parts of me that I hated every day. It was at this time that I can remember two distinct moments in which that numbness started to kind of fall away. The first was Christmas 2016, and I remember it well because I have a large family, and we were all going around the table talking about the wonderful things that had happened to us that year, and it came around to my turn, and I didn't have anything positive to say. I hate who I've become this year, I said. I'm going to go back to therapy and get the help I need. The second instance was when my livelihood was threatened when it came out at work that I was gay. In an instant, everything changed. No longer were the years I had spent serving my students of any value. And unfortunately, I became unnecessary to that greater mission of the organization. And had I not gone back and gotten the support I needed at the time, I would have allowed this mistreatment of me to take a hold and the numbness to also continue its pattern. And so thankfully, after a lot of really difficult conversations, I left that toxic environment. I believe in a world where I can help other people, but only because I push the boundary of my own personal development first. I believe reactive attachment disorder has its struggles, but it does not have to take up all my time and exhaust me. And eventually, the numbness did wear off, and underneath it all, I found I was still intact. And for the first time, I started feeling things really feeling things that I hadn't in a long time. Grief and joy and sorrow and delight and a value. And more than just feeling each of these, I found a purpose and a place for them in my life. And so as I close, I have one final thought. It is okay for you to help yourself first before you help anybody else. I love my parents, and it is not their fault that there was not a better support in which to raise a child with reactive attachment disorder at that time. But we do not live in that world today. Today, we live in a world where there is an endless supply of continuously researched resources to help parents raise children with mental health issues. Mistakes were made. Those words were said at a time when admitting a mistake was seen as a sign of strength and not weakness. And so let's move forward, but in conversation. And those conversations need to include the hopes and the fears and the questions and the struggles and the concerns of the individual with whom the diagnosis is concerned. Because if we include them in those conversations and provide a safe space in which they can share about that and truly believe in return what they are saying they are feeling, then perhaps we can stop the numbness from taking a hold for so long in the next generation. Thank you.